Welcome to our latest edition of Office Hours. I am Joe Perfetti. Today, we are going to be focusing on Agile Teams. Our show name is There Is No I in Team. Joining me today are my guest panelists, Bob Parker and Scott Coer. So if you guys want to quickly introduce yourselves. Bob, why don't you go first?
My name is Bob Parker. I run a program called the Pit Crew Challenge, which is an experiential learning activity to drive high-performing cultures.
And Scott?
Great. Good to see you, Joe and Bob. Scott Coer, work at Geisinger as the Vice President for Strategy and Planning for Education and also Dean of Graduate Education, where I'm also on the faculty, and I'm a partner with Joe at Percipient.
And Scott's also got some articles on Agile Teams, which are worth checking out. So today we want to talk about teams and building teams, and we have some content that we want to get into. But before we do, Bob, who is fresh back from a live training session in Canada.
Yeah, can you see me smiling?
And actually did something yesterday. And I hear about that team building experience in a COVID world. How did you even do this?
I'm so excited. I was probably as excited as I was. Actually, the first time I ever delivered the Pit Crew Challenge when I created it 19 years ago, I think I was more nervous because I had no idea what I was doing. But I don't think I've been so excited about doing the Pit Crew in quite some time, just because it was nice to get back in front of an audience, in front of a live group and around the race car and doing that particular experience. How we managed to do it, we had a client who, had a team, a brand new team coming together, all new hires actually. They hire seasonally. They actually work at a university, and it's a group they would bring in every year. And we had a conversation about what we could do, given COVID and everything that's going on. How can we work within the rules and then even tighten the rules a little higher and raise the bench on those rules, and then still be able to pull it off. So the great thing about our program, we're typically outdoors, which lends great to the experience. And that not only are you outside, but that also alleviates some of the pressure of being indoors. So since we're in Ontario, Canada, our current what allows the groups that we're allowed to get together, we can get as many as 50 people together out actually in a room, and as many as 100 if you're outdoors. Now, our Pit Crew program, we like to keep it under 30. We had 25 people, which was very manageable for the space we had. So, of course, we required everyone to wear masks, and that was, we're so used to that around here now, that's not a problem. In fact, in many municipalities, that is a legal requirement if you're going in a public space. Not out necessarily out in open air, but everyone has a mask with them now.
Sorry to interrupt, but I know people were wearing masks, obviously, doing everything they had to do to change the tires, etc. Did anything happen differently about the way that the content was taught or the way the participants used the content? Anything change? Because
no, actually, well, with this particular program we created, we're calling this program Pit Crew Light, which means we actually take out the content, or not all the content. We take out a fair amount of content and just really, thin down some of the points so we can get them out very quickly, so that we can get back by the race car. So we had some very, so I guess to answer your question, we were mindful of the amount of time people would spend sitting, listening to content, or for that matter, debriefing it and having those conversations, which just made the whole activity easier. Because again, when people are masked, harder to hear people, and that sort of stuff. So we lightened up on that learning significantly, and that allowed us to keep the program moving along. And then that shorter version also gave us some measures of comfort as well in how their proximity to each other.
Yeah.
So, and I think we require people to wear safety glasses all the time. So everyone got brand new safety glasses, put them on, don't take them off, don't put them on a table. Then there's somebody else's safety glasses. they're yours, right? And a few other things within the delivery of the program. We just said, hey, you can't do this, can't do that, which you might normally be able to do. And the great thing about new audiences, we get a new audience every time. They don't know what they can or couldn't do beforehand. So when you introduce the rules, it's like, okay, those are the rules, and we'll follow them. And that gives us, so we had a great amount of flexibility, which allowed us to be agile. And we work within those rules.
Well, and again, I appreciate the context, because in today's world, we're all reinventing. It's almost like we're archaeologists looking back at what we used to do 6 months ago, and in this world after COVID, anytime we're doing something new or in our world, it's actually kind of breakthrough. So congratulations on being able to run a program successfully.
Thank you. And the one thing I do want to share is the client mentioned to me, the general manager, she was very great about it. But what she said specifically that resonated was, we know that life is full of risks, and every business has risks in it. And it's important for us to, try to mitigate the risk as much as we can. And this is we're going to work in. We're going to talk about this when we talk about agility today. I'm sure at least I'll bring it up. But she says we all have to deal with risks. The question is, it can't be no risk ever. Great if it was no risk. But there's always going to be some inherent risk in pretty much everything that we do, and as long as we can manage it and it's acceptable risk, then we're fine. And everyone had the opportunity to bow out, be what they felt they needed to be. Everyone was empowered to have their own comfort level. In other words, they weren't pressured to do something that they didn't want to do or be a part of. And that's a big part of it.
And that seems like a good segue into just our topic for today about teams, because it seems like, one of the things that we felt, and we just had a couple of graphics here, but one of the things that we felt about teams that was very important is that as leaders, we're now context setters, that it's about providing content support to teams rather than permission and direction. And that's one of the things that makes the Agile team, and that would presented with the information and the rules, that the teams would actually be more effective. And it sounds like, in a way, that's part of what your program embraced, in the fact that you were able to run it all.
Yeah, and we didn't ignore the fact that it went on, and that COVID was part of it. I tried not to say the word COVID, 50 times. In fact, I worked around it. And I said that thing of which we will not speak. But we all know what that meant. And so we weren't going to let that get in our way, but we also had to be mindful of it. And I think that's really important. It is there, and let's take the precautions around it. We're not just going to throw caution in the wind and say, don't worry about it. If it happens, it happens. That's not where we went. We had to manage all of our values, and safety was one of our values. And in pit crew, that is one of the values, of course, that you have to have on a pit crew, and the teams that we teach. So we ensured that was part of it, and that value drew it, and that was by giving that context up front.
Yeah, this is great.
Bob, I appreciate. Well, congratulations. First time back. Can't wait to be back in a classroom as well with a bunch of exec ed participants. So. You said something important, many important things, but one that jumps out at me is, this is the first time the group had been through it. They don't know the rules. You set the context. You prepared them for an activity. With your years of experience, are there any, key takeaways that come to your mind as we all begin to tee up these experiences for groups and teams, setting that tone, being even more thoughtful and deliberate in our word choice, how we describe the rules, how we deliver an assignment. Anything come to your mind with this? And I ask it because you also mentioned that you can't pick up all of the traditional cues. So when my mask is on, you can't tell if I'm, grinning ear to ear, or if I'm scowling at you. And, any lessons learned, any tricks or tactics that come to your mind to help set the context for work with groups and teams?
Yeah, sure. So I think it comes down to asking questions, making sure that people do understand. So you've got to get the responses that need. So it's a closed-ended question in some cases. When it's the masks, it's yeses and nos, those sorts of things that people can give you those cues. I mean, you're looking at other, body language cues as well. Are they moving away from you? Are they moving towards you? I mean, we did our brief standing up, so that's what also, kept the energy. We don't normally do that, but because
it's only in Joe's finance and strategy.
Yeah,
it's only when we're with Joe.
I just hand out pillows in my finance class. So
the big thing for, we teach this in PICRU, and is a big thing for agility for me is about removing ambiguity, or for that matter, managing ambiguity. So because people don't know what they're walking into, they think they know what they're walking into, but then now they've got to perform. And so they may have the overarching goal that they have to do, but they don't know how they're actually going to do it or how they're allowed to do it. So we've got to be able to manage that ambiguity. So how we do that is to remove as much of the ambiguity as we can. So make them comfortable with the environment that they're in and help them understand why the environment is the way it is. So, why can't you take off your safety glasses? Or if you do take them off because you want your eyes to breathe, you're holding on to them, or you're putting them on your head or somewhere else, but you're not putting them down. You're keeping your gloves on. So all the things that we need you to do, we're going to remove as much ambiguity as we can. But where there is ambiguity, then what we want people to do is then we want to coach them through that. So have the conversations about here's where we are now, here's where we're going forward, and things of that matter. So you manage that ambiguity through coaching, and keep those conversations going. Remove it when you can. Coach through the ambiguity and uncertainty when you can't.
Yeah, that's great. As a matter of fact, I started to think through the Tuckman process of storming, forming, norming, performing that the teams have to go through. So, Scott, is that still the way that Agile teams work?
Yeah, Tuckman, he came up with this theory back in 1965. Do you believe it? So much of how we think about teams hasn't changed, but it's evolved. So, Tuckman gave us a good start, but the roles of teams, I would argue, is different now. So while you still have to storm, form, and norm, you also, and I don't know if you've got this slide for us, Joe, but you've also got to find ways that teams continue, the way teams learn and grow and evolve and interact. So, with Percipient, we added in socializing, agitating, and synergizing. So, technology today requires that teams are in a constant, state of socialization. They're looking for feedback. Joe, you talk about this in the context of, poker and making bets. A bet is an ask for more information. Socializing in teams is the exchange of, thoughts, feelings, emotions, moods, crazy ideas. Teams have to have that socialization foundation, but they've also got to have what we like to refer to as positive agitation. They've got to have this, continuous candor, gut check, reality. And, I love this, simple-minded visual because, agitation in teams is not necessarily bad. Positive agitation, and, that is an agitator in a washing machine. Positive agitation is essential, and, leaders do it, but teams do it themselves with each other. And that continuous state of positive agitation keeps teams sharp and moving. And then the last thing is, they've got to synergize. They've got to practice. They've got to be coached. They have to coach and regulate each other. And that's where they, are, synergizing and always ready for the next challenge, always ready for, the next thing. So yeah, Tuckman's relevant, and, to be even more agile, we just added on to it. And, 65 to 2020.
So just two observations. Tuckman, I assume, said you had to go through these stages consecutively. Is that the case?
Sequentially.
Socializing, agitating, synergizing? Is that still a sequence, or is that different?
Great question. No, those things are happening all at once. You can't control it. You're interacting with, things that are complicated, complex, sometimes chaotic. And these things happen concurrently. And in effect, some members of the team will be going through different elements of this on their own, not just as a group. So there's this individual reality, there's a subgroup reality, there's a team reality, and these are all taking place within varied context. So really important point that you make there. And you're right, Tuckman was thinking about this in a sequential manner.
It's also interesting that both of you use the word coaching. That, Bob said he has to coach them through the process. So when Scott's talking about Bob, that he's coaching individually, team, like what are you coaching in terms of the process? Just generally, what are you trying to coach on? Where are people falling down?
Well, so let's start with a definition of coaching. I think that would probably be good, or at least putting a framework. A frame around it.
Who runs a team, like the football coach, the basketball coach?
Yeah, exactly. Because I don't think so. Not a lot of sports coaches tend to behave in ways that they should coach, right? I may have mentioned this before on one of our last conversations, but Michael Lewis on his podcast, was it not Break the Rules, Behind the Rules? Just lost the title of it. Please look up Michael Lewis. He's the guy
Break all the rules. Yeah,
Break all the rules. Thank you. That's what it is. Break
Yeah.
all the rules. In fact, that is what it is. And it came to my head first. I went, that can't be it. But it is Break the Rules. Season 2 was all about coaching, and it was brilliant because he does talk about coaches and coaching Little League and all this sort of stuff, and how the coaches scream at them, and but the kids seem to really kind of respond to that in some ways. But yet we're having a harder time with that in a corporate world. If I scream at you in a corporate world, well, now I've got a harassment complaint and I'm running to HR, of which, of course, Lewis does talk about that in his podcast. But it's a great podcast to talk about, the power of coaching and why it's important, and everyone needs a coach. Everyone should have a coach, regardless of what it is that you do. So that's what's up. But when we talk about coaching specifically, we're talking about something that's a two-way dialogue to improve performance. So coaching is not a one-way feedback. This is how I want you to do it. That's feedback. That's not coaching. So this is why it comes out of that sports realm, because a lot of times in sports, it's, no, you've turned your foot this way, turn it that way. Or can you stop hitting that guy if it's hockey? Don't do that anymore. Or I want this or I want that. But coaching in an organizational agile team performance is things like starting with questions: what did you hope to accomplish? How do you feel you did? Do you need additional resources to get there? Were there things that you didn't accomplish that you hope to, that you'd like to? So everything is very question based. You can get people to identify where they need their own improvements by just asking the right questions. You don't actually have to tell them where you failed. Obviously, if through your questioning you're having a challenge getting someone to state the thing that is not working well in the organization, then you're going to have to introduce that at some point during your coaching session, and it will look more like feedback. But when we talk about coaching, particularly in Pit Crew, we break it down into, did you share information to help people improve performance? So it's not always questions in the heat of the moment. You can't stop, in the heat of a Pit Crew and go, all right, now let's have a coaching conversation while the clock is going and you're trying to execute. But it is about making sure that were we set up and were we giving each other permission to share information back and forth to improve performance.
So it seems like you need to have a lot of trust in that environment to be able to share both ways. And it reminds me of this cartoon with Lucy and the ball, because if that's the feeling, then the coaching is going to fail.
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought that one up, because this is something that I want to talk about. And this is something that people are not talking about enough. So when we go in sessions and we talk about what do you have to do to have an agile team, and we talk about, you got to have trust, you got to build trust, got to build trust. The one thing we don't talk enough about is the erosion of trust. And I think erosion of trust is probably baked into the Tuckman model for sure, but we don't tend to identify it enough. And I got to tell you, I think it's probably one of the biggest problems we have in teams is trust erosion. And COVID and people working from home, I think, put a dent into, or could potentially put a dent in trust for a lot of teams, because with distance, you have a greater opportunity to erode at trust. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah.
Scott?
Yep.
Yeah, Scott?
Yeah, I agree with you. The and this goes back to that, agitation. Are we connected? Are we meeting? Are we communicating at a frequency that meets, both of our needs? Both of our needs to get the work done, both of our needs to remain reliable, trusted team members. And, out of sight, out of mind is real. And I would argue that with increased complexity, that trust can erode more rapidly. So with increased complexity, the best teams and the best coaches, the best leaders of teams, find mechanisms to keep their folks together, to keep that synergy alive. And, it's a relationship, it's sort of, it's familial. If you aren't making the investment in the success of others, you're not making an investment in the team. And I would argue that you're not even a valuable team member if you're not trying. And I tell you what, that's hard. And all of us struggle with this. So, you got a guy or a gal at work, and they're just a pain in the back end. They're just really rubbing you the wrong way, but they're a member of the team. What do? Well, you can't ignore them.
Which a lot of people try to do.
That's right.
Right
there with you. Can't ignore them. Can't move without them because we know we'll pay the price later. Can't always throw them off the team. They may be a bigger team member than you. So, that erosion of trust, you're right. It's almost like you got a guard. Maybe the coach is the guard against erosion. You're managing that shoreline, and you gotta be diligent.
Yeah. For some reason, as you guys are talking, I go back to those 1990s outward bound training classes that teams used to run through. And I remember one of the exercises where you'd have to fall backwards and have your team member assume that they were going to catch you. And it's almost like that to me is the metaphor for the erosion of trust, is that the first time they don't catch you, then nothing will work effectively as a team thereafter. And so it's almost like there's this trust bank, and you got to make sure that you don't, bounce the checks, and you have to keep making deposits over time. Otherwise, the team's not going to function. And that's a really, I think, interesting point you guys are making.
Yeah, so it's interesting because then you have the conversations around things like, is trust given or is trust earned? And it's clearly both, but which is it? Which comes first? It's a chicken and egg story of sorts. Do I give a little first? Which I think is how it tends to work. I'll trust you until you do something which causes me not to trust you. But I'm only going to give a little bit at a time. I'm not going to give you full-on trust, but I'll give you a little, and we'll see how you do with that. And then I'll give you a little bit more and see how you do with that. But it can come back very quickly, right? Even though I may keep giving you more and more and more, one bad thing, and I pull that reel all the way back.
Yeah.
And so I think, it's funny because we talk so much about building trust, building trust, building trust, building trust, building trust, and it only takes one thing to cause the entire structure of trust with that individual, or for that matter, an entire team, to just immediately go down to zero.
Yeah.
The sad thing is, what tends to happen in a lot of organizations is no one wants to have the conversation around it. We're not willing to have those difficult conversations. And I think that's really what drives a lot of Agile teams, is we're willing to say, hey, this isn't working, or whether that's the leader or the other members of the team. So when you add in those elements of psychological safety, that other people are maybe permitted as part of your code in your group, other people are allowed to call other people out on behaviors, or at least, hey, what you just did there, Bill or Sally, that concerns me. I want to talk that through, because what organizations tend to, or what people tend to do on teams is, well, let's just make their life as difficult as we possibly can, and maybe they'll just leave.
Yeah.
And that seems to become the management style of so many organizations. I can't even begin to tell you how you look at leaders who don't want to manage something.
Yeah.
And that also comes down to, because I don't have the budget to fire them.
Yeah.
By the way, when you guys are talking about trust, it also plays out in the financial markets. So maybe the metaphor here is relevant, because with public companies, they're always setting expectations about their financials and what they're going to do. And then the question is, does the market believe you and give credit for it? And so generally what we do is we say you have kind of two types of companies. You have the companies that have done it consistently. And so when they make some proclamation about the future, you give them credit. So I think that in a way, the teams are probably the same thing. Like if you have experience with the teams, or, leading teams, and people can draw on that experience and say, okay, I think based on experience, I'll give you some credit. That's great until you can't do it anymore. So then the question then becomes, okay, well, if you haven't done it, how do you get to that experience? Because that's the chicken and the egg. And the only answer there is, one, you kind of measure the milestones, the short milestones along the way. You got to hit those. But the other part is, it's all about explaining your assumptions. Like, it's the context, the assumptions about clarity. Do I explain what I'm going to do? And then is it believable? So there's an authenticity element to that. And I think the same has to be true for an Agile team, that when you're starting up and you're dealing with all this uncertainty, if you're not authentically explaining the context, how the decisions are made, and what assumptions that you're using to make the decisions, then the team is going to struggle. But I think if you do that, and that's what gets everybody on board, and I think that's the synergistic aspect that Scott was talking about.
Yeah.
Synergizing. Does that make sense?
Yep.
100%. I mean, the context is huge. But there's the other element of context. So there's a context that the organization might have, or even for that matter, that the team might have. But there's a reason why we have team members, because I need their context as well. And they're all coming from their unique positions, their unique experiences, and their backgrounds, the talent that they bring to that team. So what's really important for Agile teams is to allow for that dialogue, for people to share their own unique contexts, because those unique contexts ultimately make up, where we stand now as a group. So the higher up in the organization may have come along and said, this is the reality that we're going forward with. But yet you have a team that says, well, but that wasn't our reality before. So there's that sharing difference that has to happen.
So Scott, I know in a program you and I have worked on, you've assigned this book as required reading, which is called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And,
Yep.
and it's interesting, as I pull up the graphic from this, absence of trust is one of the core dysfunctions that leads to teams not working.
Yep. And no, this is Patrick Lencioni, and great strategic management storyteller. And what I like about this book so much is when you see it, it's obvious. There's no way around not understanding this book in regard to what works and doesn't work within teams. So, as Bob pulls it out, erosion of trust, an absence of trust is, the first dysfunction of a team. And, just running through this, and not to read it, but it's worth highlighting that when teams don't trust, then they begin to have fears. When fears emerge, as rational or irrational as they might be, we shy away from conflict. And then we begin to, dissociate because we question fundamental values. Should I be committed to this? Are team members committed to me? And then as we lose that commitment, again following Bob's erosion metaphor, then accountability comes into question. Well, it's not mine, it's Bob's. That's Bob's thing. Well, I thought you were a team. Well, yeah, but that's Bob's thing. I can't do anything if Bob doesn't include me. Well, yikes. This is it's a vicious spiral, once it begins. And one of the things that I tell teams is, this is why we have to talk. This is why we have to practice. And again, there are limitations on the sports metaphors, but I do like to point out from time to time that sports teams practice a play more than most organizations practice their critical business processes. And a sports team like an American football team, and I noted that differentiation, Bob, for you, just because, I know Canadian football, whoa,
Is that even a sport?
There won't be any Canadian football this year.
All right, go ahead.
That was a sport.
Sorry, Bob.
Yeah, sorry.
But the thing is, if you're an American football team and you go into the huddle, your team's on offense, you go into the huddle and you call a play, guess what? Everybody knows what you're doing. Everybody knows what they're doing. And everybody knows what you're trying to achieve. So if you call a receiver slant, you're trying to get on the right, you're trying to get 7 yards up the field at least with a catch, and you know what you're doing. How often does this happen in organizational life? Not nearly enough. So practice matters. And do you are you just given trust? Do you earn trust? I start with the glass full. You start with trust. The assumption is trust. But in order to maintain the assumption of trust, you have to practice, and you build it over time, because things will go wrong and it's easy to lose it. So it's got to be practiced. And, Joe, I know you think a lot about this when you look at, both the marketplace, but investments in new businesses and new initiatives.
Well, and that's the point, is that I say that business cases are fairy tales. Because I'll tell you, I was on the phone yesterday. I won't name the company, but literally the leader in the call made the comment to me where he said, look, people are basically telling me what I want to hear to get their business cases approved. They're not giving me the reality of the situation. They just know how to fill out the form. And that's not what we want. That's going to establish trust. Bob?
Well, but I hate to say it, I'm gonna come to Scott on this one too, because unfortunately, a lot of our post-secondary institutions drive that sort of behavior, right? It's, if I write on my paper what I think the professor is going to give me marks for or grades for, then that's what I'm writing. So that's how we're training people. That's the practice they're getting. And they were rewarded for it. So it comes back to rewards and metrics, which is, I'm glad we brought that up because it's another issue. But I think that's a huge thing. We look at that authoritarian figure. So the point I was going to bring up was, when there is risk and there's ambiguity and there's low trust, what do teams do? They look to authority. So the quickest way to tell if your team is losing trust is when you ask for ideas and it's crickets and they just look for you to tell them what to do. If you're the leader, then your trust is eroded. If they look to, hey, Bill's the guy, Bill's the person we should all ask because he knows all about this stuff, and they're all can't wait to hear what Bill has to say because they trust Bill, then you've got trust. But if everyone just, even Bill shuts up and everyone just looks to the leader and says, well, you tell us what to do and we'll just do it. What that says to me is people are afraid to take the risk, and the trust is completely eroded. And the only trust I have is I'll keep my job as long as I do what the authoritarian says. So I think that's interesting. People are just telling me what I want to hear.
That's a good metric, by the way, that you just mentioned, because we're always looking at called the Agile dashboard metrics. Like, how do I understand if my organization is going to be able to execute? And that's a good one on innovation. Where if you're asking people for ideas and you're hearing crickets, then as you said, the trust has been eroded in the process, and innovation is going to struggle. That's really a good observation.
We see it in bigger teams all the time when we challenge them to come up with an idea, and they immediately just look to the leader in the team. Well, you just tell us what to do, and we'll do it. And you know what? They'll do it. They'll work hard at it in many cases, and they'll try to execute very well. But no, you tell us, because we don't want to get it wrong. And there's where the risk part comes in, because we know what happens when risk increases. Trust tends to go down.
Yep.
Unless we've created the culture for it. So those two tend to work against each other. And my biggest fear moving out of this pandemic as the economy starts to hopefully rebuild is exactly what happened back in 2010. Is organizations didn't take risks. It took us, Joe, you tell us, it took us 10 years to get out of that until we were finally okay, we're feeling better about risk now. And then COVID happened. And now there's still people who are running the organizations from 10 years ago saying, I've been here before. And this is how we survived, was we cut back risk. And my point is, no, but it took you 10 years to get out of it. I think the risk thing needs to be moved up. But how do you play on risk unless there's trust? Unless there's trust.
Well, and the problem that we're having that's exacerbated in today's world, if you look, you look at the stock market's like, oh, everything looks great. The stock market's doing well. And the reason why performance, I think, and it's just a theory on my part, but the reason why performance isn't as bad is because what people have done is they've cut all investment in the future. So the real consequence of what you're talking about for the COVID financial impacts are going to happen in the next couple of years, based on the fact that people are making decisions now to say, all right, I'm going to focus on the crisis stuff, but I'm not going to invest in the future. And that's where we start heading down that slippery slope, which leads to another question I have for both of you guys, because one of the reasons why I was coming up with the show title for, there's no I in team, is I was just watching The Last Dance. If you've seen it, with the Chicago Bulls story with Michael Jordan on ESPN. Do you get that up in Canada, Bob?
We do, but I haven't seen the show. No.
Well, it's interesting. It's a history of the Chicago Bulls, and particularly they won 6 NBA titles, and Michael Jordan was probably the best player on the planet at the time. It's his last season, Last Dance, that they're together as a team. But the point of the story is, it's not highlighted in the show as much as just more history of basketball, which is Michael Jordan is one of the greatest basketball players of all time. When he first came in the league, he was so far ahead of the league. He was scoring, most points per game. Nobody could guard him. They actually changed the rules of basketball to prevent him from scoring as much as he could. Yet they never actually won championships. And it wasn't until he realized that there's 4 other players that on the court that have to get the ball, where he cut back on his scoring and he cut back on his offense, but got involved in teams, that they won 6 consecutive championships.
Right.
And so I'm just wondering, in the business world, like, how does the individual thwart the team with individual performance?
Yep.
If you have any experience or thoughts on that, as it relates to Agile teams.
Well, Joe, I think that this is where systems mindset is woven into teams, right? So, the late, great Russ Akoff used to talk about sometimes you have to hurt a part of the whole in order to improve the performance. So that's antithetical if you've got a bunch of team members who are worried about their own performance. And the example that you described is great, but when the parts of a team interact, and everybody understands the play the rules, the context, the values, the desired goals or outcomes, all of a sudden the interaction of the parts creates something greater than any one individual or 5 individuals who, mysteriously think they might be a team. So, Agile teams have a systemic context, a systemic awareness. And that's part of the practice. That takes time. So Jordan came in, as you highlighted, and he was going to score 40 points a night regardless of what the rest of the players did on his team or on the other. But when his team began to play together, he may or may not score 40 points, but they were going to win.
So, I think it's a great story because I'd probably love to see the rest of it right now, actually, before I talk out of turn. But I'm curious to know what the trust level was between the other players and Jordan. Did they cover that in the show, like in those first years or so when he was scoring the 40 points and no one else was? What was the relationship?
It would be low. And one of the things that made the show unique, and they weren't intending to do this at the time, but they actually let a documentary crew film the entire 82-game season that they won the final championship. So they had like thousands and thousands of hours of behind-the-scenes footage, which in historical context, they're now showing stuff that they probably wouldn't have politically shown at the time. So
right.
You can actually see, and they had clips from the earlier years where, he was like the superstar and he just didn't care about his teammates. And, in coaching, it was interesting because, one of the things is the guy's an asshole. And the question is, he was mean to his other players, but the point was he was mean to his other players because he wanted them to be better.
Yeah.
And to get towards his level. In a way, given your definition of coaching, that makes more sense than the feedback approach because he was pushing for interaction as opposed to just telling them what to do. But in any event, it's probably worth a look. But I'm still more interested in a practical point here. So let me say it a different way. I have a performance review. My boss gives me a performance review, but I'm on a team. And if I have to take a hit for the team, how do I handle that performance review? Because that's where I think that accountability, trust, and metric kind of gets in the way because we don't have team performance in the corporate world. We have individual performance in the corporate world. I mean, we have a business unit, but we're not grading the team together. And as a matter of fact, even when I grade my teams in class, I always have the students who are like, well, that person didn't do all the work, and so therefore I should get the grade and they shouldn't. So how do we work against that?
It's all wrong. In my opinion, the quick answer is we've got it all wrong. We're using an antiquated system of measuring performance and rewarding performance. It's antiquated to a system of agility in teams, and they are two different things. So go back to the sports analogy. The Chicago Bulls win the championship, right? It's ultimately what's the prize at the end. We've got to make the prize bigger, which is why you hear organizations talk about purpose, and that becomes the driving force. When the only thing is compensation, if that's the only reason why you have that job nowadays, then we can't move towards agile teams. We'll never have agile teams if you only come to work worried about compensation. So it's interesting, Joel, just as a quick aside. So in Canada, of course, we're going to talk about hockey, and Wayne Gretzky is the same example as the Michael Jordan example. However, I don't think Gretzky, at least in Canadian lore, ever went through the period of not wanting to coach his team members. In fact, he was kind of the antithesis. He did it the opposite way because the Edmonton Oilers just won championship after championship very early once Gretzky joined the team. But Gretzky always said, hey, I was there to make great players great. And they did have great players on the team, again, just like the Chicago Bulls did. But here's the point that, and I wrote about this. This was part of one of the things I wanted to bring up, is this question: why is longevity or seniority? Why is it a given for all sorts of rewards, from everything from compensation to bonuses to promotions to even in the frontline workers to shift preference? Why is longevity used as the basis in so many organizations when it has very little to do with the value you provide. Michael Jordan comes in on day one, and he's leaps and bounds against the people who've been on the team for 3 years.
Yep.
And Gretzky would be the same. Again, we are talking sports here.
Yep.
And I realize there is some benefit to the fact that you've been around for a while, you've showed some loyalty, and is loyalty tied to trust a little bit, perhaps? But we've got an antiquated system in how we give promotions. And quite frankly, I've seen a lot of experience of people that have been around the longest actually produce the least amount of work.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
That's
So,
why coach back in the day tried to get rid of that bottom 20%, because you see the tail off productivity. So,
right.
So as I'm listening to you, here's how I interpret this. We're rewarding experience, and what you're advocating for is a meritocracy. And that's not something that we have. And what I say is longevity equals experience. I'm not saying that they should be correlated, but I think they're actually correlated.
And I don't necessarily buy that longevity builds experience, right? Because you could be somewhere 20 years and only have 1 year of experience, but you have it 20 times, that same experience 20 times over, right? Did you actually grow as an individual? Did you get better at what you do? Do you have more to offer? And that's why we keep talking about coaching, because coaching is supposed to increase what you have to offer. And so those of us in the training and development world say, well, yeah, how much training do you have under your belt? How much development do you have? How much time have you spent, Scott, practicing in those role plays and the actings and the things you did to actually get better at what you did? That's where I think we should be looking at, promotions and compensations, is to say, how much better did you get this year over last year? We want to take it back into sports, and I'm going to negotiate your contract. How much better were your numbers this year than last year? And what's your potential for future numbers? That's going to be determined by how much I pay you. In fact, the longer you've been in this league, the less chances I'm going to pay you more. Now, of course, in the sports world, that's predicated on the fact that you're, in the sport, in football, your knees will blow, your whatever parts of your body will fall apart. You're probably not going to have that sort of longevity. But in the business world, how well have we given you the opportunities, first of all, and have you taken those opportunities to get better? So, I mean, I'm sorry to really interrupt you there, Joe, but I don't know that experience necessarily does it, because I think we think it does. Our systems have driven that.
But look at the sports world. So two things have changed in the way of athletes' pay. And we can focus originally on baseball, because that's what Billy Beane and Moneyball and the Oakland A's started. Look, I'm going to reward people based on sabermetrics, which is, here's the other thing. They were also predictive, meaning that today athletes are paid more about their future expectations than their past performance. And that's the change, because 10 years ago, if you had 3 good seasons, you got rewarded with a giant contract. Now, if you have 3 good seasons, you're near the end of your career. So I don't care what you just did. The stats say that your line's going to go down, and therefore I can't pay you. And that's a change that sports made that I don't know if corporations have actually embraced in any form in the way that they run.
Yeah, and I'm certainly not. Don't hear me. I'm not advocating anything of that nature. I think that's pretty harsh. But at the end of the day, you can have that. So let's say you're in a media business and you need to produce video, and you want to get it through social media. You want to get that online and understand that. Am I hiring a 50-year-old or am I hiring a 25-year-old to do that job?
I'd be very careful about the answer to that question, because in the United States, you can get sued for the answer to that question.
Fair enough. In Canada, not so much. I mean, certainly it's not necessarily their age, but if you're looking at the experience, right? 50-year-old might not have the experience at producing video. I mean, you've got the age of TikTok, you've got the age of YouTube and influencers. Those people know those platforms and know how to create a video in their sleep, and have probably more experience than the 50-year-old being able to do it. In fact, they can do it and get to the audience very, very quickly. So, if I was looking at somebody to do stuff in that realm, I want somebody who knows how to do it instinctively and very, very well. So they may not have a whole lot of experience in my company. They may only have a year or two, but they may be the highest valued person with that particular technology.
So Scott, you've been kind of listening to this. How would you weigh in?
So I think it goes back to the start of our conversation here. What are we going to reward? What are we keeping score of? And individuals are going to try to fit into the frame. And if the frame is about winning versus the frame is about my performance, I think that outlines the way people will behave. What else is tricky here is, as organizations become increasingly complex, do we have the capacity for teams to blur lines even more? So do we have the intellectual, emotional capacity, the resilience for an organization that has 3 different types of business, but the ability to work across those businesses for products and services and improve the performance of a whole, even if one of the 3 dips a little? That gets complex. And I think it goes to your point, Joe. Are organizations making that adaptation? Well, those that are most agile are. And you look at Amazon and others that can almost seamlessly or apparently seamlessly move into other industries. Who knew Amazon would be in the grocery business? Well, they've got the backbone, the foundation to do it, but clearly the teams and the folks who came up with that idea were not penalized for thinking beyond, their silo, their structure. Mm-hmm. So how do we prepare teams to work effectively, to have the values and the measures that improve the whole, but at the same time, not have the fear of being told to stay in your lane?
Right.
That's tough, because I hear that a lot in organizations. Stay in your lane. Hear it a lot. Don't boil the ocean. Don't think those kinds of thoughts. We've got to have operational excellence. Well, if we're alive next week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Keep your head down. Try not to get your head cut off.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know we're coming here to the end of our time. And one last thing, Bob, you had sent some slides. Did you want to?
Yeah, this might be a good sort of thing to end on, because we talked a little bit about the idea of sort of purpose, right? Is that thing that is beyond compensation. And don't get me wrong, we all work because we need to get compensated, but it's that drive that really kind of helps the organization and the teams come together. So one of the best stories and research that I probably have ever read would go back to Ellen Langer's 1978 study. Scott, are you familiar with the photocopy experiment?
No, tell me.
Joe, you're not. So here's basically how it worked. You would both remember that back in the days of when we were all going through post-secondary, you had to go in, if you're writing an article, you could go to the library, get the periodicals, but you weren't allowed to take those out. So you had to stand in the photocopy line. Or at that time, we'd call it the Xerox machine, right? You stand in the Xerox line, get the photocopies of all your periodicals so you could take them home and write your articles. Do you guys remember that?
Yeah.
How many hours we'd spend in the lineup at the library. Anyone who's in post-secondary today doesn't have that experience, because they just go online for those articles and they're all posted, or they can get those periodicals. So that's one of those hard-nosed sorts of things. So in 1978, you can imagine this photocopy machine was a great innovation to be able to get that. So imagine you're standing in line, and Ellen Langer had students that part of the study would try to bud in line for this long lineup at the photocopier, and to see if they could actually get in. So there was 3 lines that they came up with. Joan, if you want to throw that back up again, here's the 3 lines. The first one was they would come up and say, "Excuse me, I have 5 pages. May I use the Xerox machine? The next one was, excuse me, I have 5 pages. May I use the Xerox machine because I'm in a rush? And then the third one was, excuse me, I have 5 pages. May I use the Xerox machine because I have to make copies? So the first one was no excuse, just simple. I just need to use the machine. Can I butt in line? And so let's look at the results, Joe, of the first compliance. What we saw was they would get 60% compliance by just saying, may I use the Xerox machines? Because people are nice, and it's just, sure, if you've only got 5 copies, go ahead of me. Even to this day in the grocery store, you might say, oh, you got just a couple items, go ahead of me. So then they added in what they call the excuse, or this is the because line. And so the excuse, the next line, of course, there is because I'm in a rush. Interesting thing is, once you gave any excuse, they got a 94% compliance. But it was a good excuse. Well, you're in a rush. Okay, well, I'll let you have that. So then the test was to see if we just could give a really silly excuse. And that's the third one. May I use the Xerox machine because I have to make copies? Which is a complete bogus excuse. We're all standing here making copies. Why would I let you in? So the compliance to that, Joe, if you go to the next slide, the compliance to that only dropped by 1 percentage point. It still got 93%. You may look at this as completely insane. I can't believe that last excuse got in. Well, the reason why it gets in is because what people need, they just need reasons. And if you give people a reason to do something, then they're far more compliant and they're far more able to actually do it, and willingly, even if it's a silly excuse. Now, do I advocate giving people silly excuses to do things at work? No, but what I'm advocating is that we need to give people reasons, and those are things like purpose statements, and it goes right back to the beginning of the conversation we talked about, which is the context piece, and it's framing that context around these are the reasons that are allowing us to do this. But that's the tool that organizations really should have in their back pocket, is don't just ask your people to do stuff. Give them a reason, give them a purpose, and they're far more motivated to do stuff. You'll get 93% compliance.
No, I think that's really sage advice for an team. And as you said, probably a topic for a different show, because I think this also gets into purpose and meaning. But we'll just leave that as a reason to come back. So again, thanks, Bob. Thanks, Scott, for your time. If anybody is looking to learn more about building your teams through purpose, through trust, through adjusting your metrics, or to really learn how to coach and improve, you can find out more information at learningcommunities.com, and you can also get contact information for Scott and Bob. And if you live in Canada, you can actually probably have a live training session if you ever wanted one.
Southern Ontario right now is where we're saying. So Southern Ontario. Yeah.
But regardless, I want to thank everybody for your time today, and this will end our broadcast. Until next time.
Great. Thanks.
Great.